Good evening. I'm Trey Johnson, and welcome to Museum After Hours, our monthly lecture series. This evening's presentation, The Real Story of the Donner Party, will be delivered by Marian Calabro. Calabro is a writer, editor, and historian. She's author of numerous nonfiction history books for young adults and general audiences. Her book, The Perilous Journey of the Donner Party, is an American Library Association notable book, Scholastic Book Club selection, and multiple award winner. Calabro is also accomplished in writing poetry, essays, and plays. The Real Story of the Donner Party describes how, in the spring of 1846, a group of about 90 emigrants left Illinois, headed west to California in covered wagons. They were intrigued by reports of free land and a great climate for farming. Their journey became one of the most tragic stories of American Western migration. Snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the Donners lost half their party to starvation and disease. Their almost hopeless struggle for survival pushed some to cannibalism. Although cannibalism is what they're remembered for, there is much more to the story. Through survivors' letters and diaries, Calabro retells their experiences in the presentation this evening. We'll have some time afterwards to answer some questions, so be sure to enter those questions into the Q&A feature, and we will get to as many as we can after the program. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Marian Calabro.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, welcome to the real story of the Donner Party, and welcome to my home in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, which is about 10 miles west of New York City. This is where I wrote The Perilous Journey of the Donner Party and several other history books. I want to thank the Kansas Historical Society and the Kansas Museum of History for making this program possible, particularly Joy Brennan, who reached out to me and did a lot of organization, and Trey Johnson, who you just met, who's been invaluable technically. And I'm very happy to be doing this, particularly this week, because if you turn your clock back only a mere 178 years, you would, and you were in a Donner or the Reed family, you'd be hustling to get ready to leave on April 15th, 1846. Um, One of the main questions that I often get, and I'm going to address it up front, is, how did you get interested in this? Particularly, I'm not from California, I'm not from the Midwest. The short answer is writer's curiosity and a geographic affinity. In the 1980s, my now late husband and several friends and I began to ski several winters in the Tahoe Donner area of Northern California. And for me, the landscape was love at first sight. I just loved Northern California. And I also noticed several businesses, roads, natural features were named Donner. So that spurred my historical interest. And I'm going to share my screen now to, let's see, that'll clear up in a minute. Trey, is that good? Is everyone seeing the application?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, great. Um, this is the book that ultimately came out of it. So in the course of visiting the area, we crossed Donner Summit many times, and here's how it looked on an average day taken with a black and white camera. Um, but one day when we were vacationing there, our group had driven over Donner Summit to have dinner in Truckee, and we're heading back over the summit. And I was the designated driver in a van, and I wasn't used to driving a van. And, it's full of my friends and my husband, and they're all laughing and talking. And one minute, a little snow began to swirl. And then the next minute, it was a whiteout. It was as if someone pulled down a window shade. And what do you do? We were on Interstate 80. That is what crosses the same Route 80 we have, right across the country. Starts here near me in New Jersey. and I was in the left lane. I was doing about 75, and for a few seconds the silence was overwhelming. And fortunately, we got over the summit. The squall died down, and I spoke the sentence that separates writers from the rest of normal humans. I have to write about this. So I did. Um, and this caption refers to some of the research. Went back and did much research in this area. This is what it looks like. But our episode to me was worse than this. It was as if someone pulled down a window shade. This is from the Caltrans feed on Donner Summit. And I mentioned that 178 years ago this week, you might, if you were in the Donner or Reed family, be preparing to leave Springfield, Illinois. Uh, uh, your destination would be California, which is about 2,000 miles west of Springfield. California was not yet a state. The official U.S. extended to Illinois and one of its neighboring states, Missouri. That was the United States at that point. Um, and Springfield looked like this in those days. And along this row was the law office of Abraham Lincoln, who was a state known throughout the state, but not obviously not yet president. So let's do the who, what, when, where, why. Who were they? Who were these people who decided to leave? Um, One is the Reed family, James and Margaret Reed, seen here, and they had four children. Let me see if I can move that out of the way. There we go. Um, they had four children, and Margaret's mother was along, Sarah Keyes. She's maybe known to some of you because she was ill at the time. She had tuberculosis, but she said she's going to try to get to California. Margaret's brother had gone out there a year or two earlier and made it out there, and she thought maybe she'd get to see him again, but she unfortunately passed away of natural causes in Kansas, which is one of the reasons Kansas is remembered. Um, and they had five employees. A theme of the Donner Party. There are several what I think of as very American themes in the Donner Party. They were all immigrants. Some of them were first generation, some second generation. Several of them changed their names, as immigrants often do, to Americanize their names. There were blended families. There were class differences. James was an immigrant and a striver. He had come to the United States as a teenager. He's of Polish descent by way of Ireland, and his real name is James Reed Noski, and he's a carriage maker. He owns interests in mines. He's affluent, and he served in the Black Hawk War of 1832 with Abe Lincoln, his neighbor in Springfield. So they knew each other. The Donner brothers were George and Jacob. They were quite old for the time. They were in their 60s. And they were both with second wives, Tamsin and Betsy. And together they had 12 kids. And the woman you see here is Eliza. She was the youngest. She was 3 during this winter. They too had their employees who came along. I'd like to point out that all of these were second marriages, that they were blended families. Blended families didn't start with the Brady Bunch. And the lifespans in the 1840s were pretty brutal by our standards. Women lived to about age 40, men even younger. They generally died in their late 30s. And these are statistics for free people. Enslaved people had worse statistics. Um, the entourage here had so the Donners were particularly taking risks because they were in their 60s, and they too were affluent and could have happily stayed in Springfield. But the entourage also included some servants and some hired hands. They called them teamsters, who drove the ox forward. And some of the hired hands answered an ad that said, "Why leave?" I asked why leave, and the ad said, "Westward ho, who wants to go to California without it costing them anything? Come, boys, you can have as much land as you want without it costing you anything." And it ran in this newspaper on March 19th, less than just a few weeks before they left, and that's how they hired some of their Teamsters. Um, so here's a big hint as to the why they left. They uprooted their comfortable and settled lives. You could call it ambition, you could call it greed, or you could just call it demographics. I mean, James Reed was 46, the Donner brothers were 56 and 60. So they were on the downhill of their lifespan, and they were providing for younger wives and young children. And they decided that they felt they could make the trip safely and get more land and do well for themselves and their families. And if they needed a public justification for their personal decision, they had one. It was called Manifest Destiny. And this was the beliefs that swept the US at the time that the Easterners, particularly, had to civilize the savage West. And the quote that ran in the newspaper editorial at first uses the phrase "manifest destiny," said, "To overspread and possess the whole of the continent which the providence had given us for the development of our great experiment of liberty." And they knew that indigenous people, American Indians, were in the West and had been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But this painting, which was done later because there's a railroad in it, was widely popular and hung in classrooms and was seen as a picture of American progress. Uh, Curiously, I didn't put a shot up because I didn't think we had the time, but there's another one called Reversing Manifest Destiny that was done by a Chippewa artist, Charles Hilliard. You can look that up if you'd like, or you can put a question in the chat. I can refer you to where to find it. So, why were they leaving now? Uh, Besides Manifest Destiny, they uh, they just decided that it was the right time. They were young enough, um, and the risks that they were taking also involved the chance of war because Mexico, still, as you can see in this rather crude but easy to read map, Mexico still occupied most of what we now know as the American Southwest. So that this was much on their mind. And they also had read a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which had been published by this Lansford Hastings. And he had done a trip uh, and written this. It's really more of a pamphlet than a book. And he had led people out there in 1842, I think it is. And the only problem is he didn't go in a wagon train. He went individually on a horse, and they had some pack mules to bring supplies. Big difference to go out west on a wagon train versus a small group. He didn't have wives and kids along. The Donner Party was a family journey. Um, Hastings, if you're many people, of course, are very familiar with the story, and they say, one theory is the Donners did poorly because they followed the Hastings cutoff, which was a supposed shortcut that turned out to be the opposite. We'll return to Hastings later and talk about him a little more as we progress. But just for now, he was like Manifest Destiny on steroids. He really believed he wanted to create an independent Republic of California in the way that Sam Houston had done in creating the Republic of Texas. And he wanted to be the president or the head of it. And he wanted citizens like the Donners and Reeds to populate it. So this book influenced the Donners and Reeds greatly, and they said, "Okay, we're going for it." Uh, 32 people left from Illinois, the Donners and Reeds, their children, and their entourage. By the end, we have 90 people, um, which includes two Miwok Indians who come from California east to meet them in the mountains as to help rescue. The reason that the numbers grew, as you'll see along the way, they grouped up for safety because of the impending Mexican War. And of the total 90 people, almost all were trapped in the mountains. So, what did they bring along with them? They they had uh, they made their own wagons. Reed particularly made, he was a carriage maker, so he made a very beautiful wagon, which the others derisively called the Pioneer Palace car. Um, and they knew that they would be traveling with oxen. Horses are not practical. You know, when a horse snaps its ankle, that's the end. Oxen, two per covered wagon, and a few to spare. The oxen are really the engines of the journey. They brought along milk cows because they needed milk, they needed dairy. They did have a few horses. James rode his mare, which was apparently a beautiful horse, and his stepdaughter, Virginia, who turned 13 on the journey, he bought her pony to go along the way, pony named Billy. And that was pretty thrilling. And then there were dogs, many, the family had little dogs. Some of them were working dogs. They would herd the oxen, and some were pets. Um, in fact, besides being remembered for cannibalism, you may or may not know that their little dog Cash ended up going into the kettle on New Year's Eve of 1846. He sacrificed his little terrier body for his now starving family. Um, and I'll say up front, if these kinds of things make you squeamish or feel sick, as they do for me, I take a cue from the Reed daughters. Virginia was 12 going on 13. Patty, her sister, who was 9. A poor little dog saved us from death of hunger. Don't doubt me, this is true. I love the kids in this story, in this journey. They were often more sensible than the adults. But New Year's Eve is far away, and we have a long way to go here. So they traveled in these covered wagons. Each family had three. One was the equivalent of an RV or a camper. That was where they rode by day and slept by night. Another one was the supply wagon, um, where they would go in daily to get food, extra clothes. The women had yarn, fabric scraps, needlework supplies, tools, guns, ammunition, fat, grease, soap, candles, wheels, extra wheels for the wagons. And then the third vehicle was the equivalent of a moving van, where they didn't go into it. It was the big things that they would be using in California: furniture, winter clothes, heirlooms. Tamsin Donner, George's wife, was an educated and refined woman. She had been a teacher. That's how he met her when he hired her when he was widowed and hired her to tutor his children. And she carried future school supplies. She planned to open an academy in California. She had books on botany, she had Shakespeare. And of course, we have to consider food. So I'm Italian, so I have to know what people eat. And this is not the Mediterranean diet. Here is a reference to some of the extras that they carried as well. There were a few, children's toys. That Patty Reed's doll pictured here is one of the very, very few physical items that still exist today. There were trinkets because they expected to meet Indians along the way, and they had been advised that they could trade trinkets and so on. Silks, lace, gold pieces that were hidden away, textbooks, paints. The food list is there's not a lot of produce on here, right? um, this is typical. They would take flour, bacon, sugar, coffee. Everyone likes caffeine. So lots of salt, cornmeal, cured meats, dried beans that you can, add water to these things and turn into a cornmeal mush or hush puppies. Uh, but any fresh meat had to be killed, hunted and killed along the way, and produce was really almost non-existent, though they did bring some dried fruit and dried beans. Buffalo meat, the meat of a young buffalo is excellent, and James Reed prided himself on being a good shot. Um, let's move into the first 3 months. They were the best. Spring and early summer on the prairie. It's pretty. The terrain is fairly easy. It's fairly flat. There were two rough spots here. Sarah Keys, as mentioned, died near what is now your Alcove Spring Historic Park, and uh, they had the party was stopped there for 5 days from May 26th to the 31st because the Blue River had high waters, the creek rose, and they could not get across. And those days, every day they lost turned out to be critical. If they had made up even one of those 5 days, the outcome of the Donner Party might have been different. And that they were stopped there near modern day Marysville. And they loved the beautiful alcove spring, and James Reed carved his name, his initials, JFR 26 May 1846, in the rock, and they buried Mrs. Keys here. Um, and they uh, the other big thing that happened along this time is they started to get a good amount of practice crossing water. There were no bridges, so if the water was shallow enough, you floated the wooden uh, bodies of the carriages across. And if it wasn't, there were generally ferrymen who were local Indians. And that happened in Kansas at the Kaw River, which is what they called it then, the Kansas River. And it was $1 per wagon at the time to ferry across the Kaw River. The Teamsters would help load the these were heavy wagons, of course, they were filled with all those things. And then Indians would go alongside with the long poles and kind of literally ferry them across. And Kansas also was an important spot because the Donner Party joined up with the Bryant Party there. Edwin Bryant had gone from Illinois to uh, California earlier and come back and was going out again. And he knew the Donners and Reeds. And so they made the decision to group up for safety and to help each other. And James Reed curiously said, I never in my life saw such a beautiful country, referring to Kansas. It referred to it as rich and beautifully situated, but he sounded like he would have been happy to just stop the trip there, but the timber was scarce, and that was a concern to them. Uh, the other big thing that happened around this time was the official declaration of war with Mexico. It was expected. James Polk, president at the time, had campaigned on getting Mexico out of the U.S., a strain that has often come up in our history. And even though it wasn't officially the United States yet, because the Republic of Texas under Sam Houston was a major bone of contention. So this grouping up took it for safety in numbers became more important. And along the way, um, they did expect to encounter Native Americans. We see some Sioux here on the warpath. They really didn't have any major or even minor skirmishes with Native Americans. But one of the uh, one of the groups that joined, these folks are significant, the Brain family. They're Irish immigrants, fairly recent Irish immigrants. The parents, Patrick and Margaret, had 7 children, no employees, but they did have a friend along, Patrick Dolan. And he was a jolly guy. He played the violin and he taught the everybody how to do the Irish jig. And he, in the early days when things were easy and nice around the campfire at night, he was a very important member of the party. Um, there were 40. Let's remember that almost half the group was teens and children. I just love this guy's face. And you know that if there's a picture of somebody, it means they've survived because there was no photography in the Midwest at the time. These pictures were taken later, California. The Murphy family came. They were an extended family: Murphys, Fosters, Pikes, the Eddies, the Graves, the Fosdicks. There were some German speaking immigrants, Keysburgs and Wolfingers. And so it was a melting pot, but it didn't always melt. It was generally each family for itself. Um, Tamsin Donner, the literary woman who wanted to start the school out in California, wrote back to her family back east. So we have some of the best people in the party, and some are not so good. She was referring to Keysburg. He was probably mentally ill. He was very abusive to his wife. James Reed, tried to read him the riot act, so to speak, but Keysburg was having none of it. Um, Charles Stanton was a bachelor and had just decided, I think, California sounds good. I'm going to try to go for it. He becomes a hero later, and we'll hear more about both these men. July was really a turning point. The 4th of July was a happy day. They stopped in Independence Rock. They're in Wyoming by now. And this is called the Great Register of the Desert. If you go up close, you'll see loads of initials and dates from when people crossed here. Um, this is also the area where they encountered what's called the parting of the ways. So just think about this. You're looking straight ahead or you're looking to the left. Um, to the branch to the right is the established Oregon Trail, which goes to the northwest. The other way is the Hastings Cutoff. So they took a vote. Who are they going to, which one are they going to follow? And this is 1846. If you're 14 years or older and a male, you can vote. There was no such thing really as adolescence. You were either a kid or an adult. So the teenage boys got to vote, but none of the women got to vote. And if the women had been able to vote, they probably would have taken the established trail. But the vote came in to follow the Hastings Cutoff. And someone who wrote about it later, who was there and in one of the parties, wrote, Mrs. George Donner was gloomy, sad, and dispirited in view of the fact that her husband and others could think for a moment of leaving the old road and confide in the statement of a man of whom they knew nothing and who was probably some selfish adventurer. And she was right. This refers to Hastings, and he was a selfish adventurer. In fact, a gentleman named James Kleiman, who's, if you've traveled out west, you've heard that name. He warned them. He tried the cutoffs. He saw the dangers. He backpacked to warn people 3 weeks earlier, and Reed blew him off. You know, they just the men had their minds made up. They were going to try the cutoff. They did take a second vote that day that made Tamsin a little happier. Her husband, George, was elected the official captain of the party, which is why we call it the Donner Party. And that was done to spite James Reed. By now, people thought he was too uppity and full of himself. So Donner has the name in perpetuity, but Reed really has the game. A lot of the decisions were made by Reed. And to me, this indicates a split in the psyches, if so to speak, of this party. It's like we're following James, but George is our leader. So you can guess that this is going to cause difficulties along the way. Let me see if I can. Oops. Oh, sorry about that. Where are we? Oh boy. Sorry about that. We we got way out of line here. Um, Let me try to get back to that map. I was trying to pinch out the map so that I could show it. There we go. Um, all right. I don't want to disrupt this anymore, but anyway, um, oh, sorry about that. We'll get here. Um, so we get to this point where, as I showed you, the purple line would have been the right-hand trail, and it goes up along a more established route. They come down here, and they're going to take down toward the where it says Fort Bridger, and then the stripe turns red, and that's going to be the so-called Hastings cutoff that ends up taking a lot more time. Um, so they came in August to Fort Bridger, which is modern day Wyoming, and it's the last trading post for 600 miles. And James Bridger was a liar. He promoted the shortcut too. They had one more chance. You can see here at the Fort Bridger where the purple and the red come together. They could have made a right there and gone up and rejoined the established trail. Uh, Bridger was a liar too because he promoted the shortcut because it bought him business. And he and a partner had also been given letters of warning to give to Reed, and he conveniently didn't give those letters. But the people in the party were able to stock up on food, get new livestock here, do their laundry, and prepare for the long haul of the rest of the trip. Hastings was supposed to literally meet them here, and he didn't show up. So they forged ahead, and they found that the shortcut became a long cut. Um, the They had to go around the Great Salt Lake, and they had to get through. They had to go around these canyons. This There was no tunnel in 1846. This picture obviously was taken later. This was taken in 1869. When the Union Pacific Railroad after it started to run. So they had to scout long ways around these bad patches. And they lost like a whole week, for instance, in this area. And they were waiting for Hastings, hoping for his help. And time is running low at this point. It seems like they have all the time in the world, but they don't. Um, and when they get to the Great Salt Lake, and they reach the desert, and there's no water. Um, it took 6 days to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert in modern day Nevada. The oxen started to die of starvation. Um, this the oxen, as I mentioned, were the engine of the trip. If they didn't have oxen, they didn't have anything to pull the wagons with. So reluctantly, they had to start abandoning some wagons, including the Reed's Pioneer Palace car. And they cached what they call cached the goods, CACHED, which is they buried some of them. So they abandoned things in the desert. These are things that have been collected from the desert from various trips across the desert in Nevada. And you can see there, it's really poignant to see here the top left, that's a kid's roller skate, a crude kid's roller skate. Lots of tools. There's a coffee grinder on the lower right. There's a violin face. Frying pans, all these things had to be left behind. And Virginia, who is about 13 at this point, says, when we left the poor old wagon as a monument to past comfort, the looking glass was not even cracked. And uh, it, it, it was very difficult. She had to leave her pony behind. Um, and um, they finally reach water, and this is what it looks like. Donner Springs, it's now known as. It's sulfuric water. It's, barely drinkable. They've lost oxen. They've abandoned wagons. The Reeds have lost two out of their three wagons. And they've rejoined the main route, when they get to Nevada, but the quote was from James Reed's diary was, all the women are mad with anger. Yeah, you bet they were. Um, and so it's usually like around this point that somebody says, why didn't they send somebody ahead to get help? Well, they did. Um, on September 10th, they sent ahead Charles Stanton, whose picture we saw earlier. He was a bachelor. So, he had no skin in the game, as we'd say, but he said, yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. Um, he didn't have a family to come back to. And William McCutcheon, who did have a wife and 1-year-old, rode ahead. And the idea was that they would get to Sutter's Fort, which is modern day Sacramento, California, and they would procure some help there. Um, Now we get into October and things get really tough. There was a incident of what we would call pioneer road rage. James Reed killed John Snyder, who was an employee of the Graves family, because their oxen yokes got entangled when they were going uh, up an embankment. And Snyder started to beat the animals with the handle of his whip. And Reed took out his knife, and then Snyder aimed his whip handle at James Reed and cut his head open. Reed stabbed Snyder in the chest. Some people say he aimed, others say he was dodging the blow or that he had blood flowing down his face. And the descendants of these people will still argue these points. It's as if no time had passed. I met several of them at what they call Donner family reunions in California when I did research. But this was a bad situation. And it was young Virginia, the teenager, who dressed her father's wounds. And the party said, let's hang him. They were fed up with James Reed. And others said, no, that's not going to help anything. Let's kind of take care of two things at once. We'll banish him from the party because his wife was, you know, frazzled beyond belief at this point. And he can go ahead and look and try to find us help too. And the group had said that, we'll help. They told him, we'll help your wife care for her children. And that didn't come to pass either. As soon as James was safely out of sight, a day or two later, they forced Margaret Reed to abandon her last car, which was the so-called Pioneer Palace car. So she and her children only had two horses to move ahead with. Luckily, they had good helpers who, at least she wasn't totally on her own. Things get worse here. They abandon a sick person, a Belgian immigrant named Hardcoop. Nobody ever recorded his first name. And William Pike, another member of the party, was killed when his pistol discharged. We don't know if he was cleaning it or what. It wasn't a murder, but things were getting bad. So they crossed the so-called 40-mile desert, and then they rested for several days at Truckee Meadows, which is modern-day Reno, Nevada, before they tackled the Sierra, which is about what they're going to go into. This is right what I call the elbow of the California map, right where it curves. Um, the Sierra Nevada is unforgiving. It is a 400-mile mountain wall with no like easy passage over it. And Anybody who's traveled out there knows how crazy the geography is. You can go from Death Valley, well, below sea level, to Mount Whitney, just, one of the tallest mountains. So the nightmare begins as this interpretive sign, and from one of the parks in California rightly says. Um, and unfortunately, the group broke up because George Donner cut his arm when he was fixing his wagon, and uh, he had to stay behind for a day or two. So the group got broken up by several miles. There was the front group and the back group, and they ended up spending the winter in different places. There was a bright spot in late October. Stanton returned with a mule train full of supplies and with two Indians, Miwok, which was the California tribe, Luis and Salvatore. Those were their Christian names given to them by Colonel Sutter at Sutter's Fort. They knew the Sierra Nevada. That was their home country, their home territory. And James Reed has made it to Sutter's Fort, and he's trying desperately to scare up some rescue parties. Well, things get very bad. Uh, the front group encamps here at Truckee Lake. Also, it was named Donner Lake. It's now called, Truckee. It was called Truckee Lake then. Um, and there was one existing lean-to, the one that you see in the right of this picture. And this picture was drawn for a magazine later on. And then these two other, the one in the foreground and that triangular one in the background, those were the three shelters that the front group took. And the lake did not freeze hard, so they always had water. No, they couldn't fish. They they tried, but the lake was essentially frozen. They couldn't hunt. It was too snowy. And one question that always comes up is why didn't they turn around and go back? The same reason they couldn't go forward. There was too much snow. Uh, this is that triangular part there in this drawing is actually still there. It's the granite wall, and it formed the back wall of one of the shelters. Just to give you an idea of the size of it, there I am doing some research. The other group, which was essentially the Donners and their people, encamped at Alder Creek. This tree was felled by lightning, but there is a plaque commemorating it. Alder Creek also didn't freeze hard, so they had water. This picture gives you a good idea of how they sheltered. They took timber, pieces, they were pine mostly, these pieces, and then they took canvas off the uh, uh, covered wagons, and they basically made sort of a teepee or a tent out of it. And the Donners were here with their many children and their helpers. Another question that comes up is, didn't everybody really know they were there? Yes. This is Sarah Winnemucca, who was the granddaughter of Chief Truckee, who the area is named for. And he said we could have saved them, she said we could have saved them, only my people were afraid of them. They did get a visit from one Indian during the winter who gave them some soap root, which you can either eat or wash with, and they ate it. Um, but they couldn't communicate and speak the same language. Cannibalism begins. Um, Unfortunately, well, a group of 15 people say, they realize they're trapped. They tried desperately to get over a few times, and the snows just kept coming. And so a group of the younger and stronger ones, 15, said, let's look, we can die here or we can die trying to get help. Let's try to get help. And they set out. Luis and Salvatore were part of the group because they knew the terrain. And that was where cannibalism began because one of them, uh, unfortunately, the delightful Irish fiddle player, fell sick, died, and it dawned on them, we're one to die, the rest might live. They did not, except in the instance which we'll talk about here, they did not kill someone in order to eat. They ate the dead. However, there were two Williams. William Eddy, he's on the left, and William Foster was on the right. And Foster said, "Well, this is working. We can kill the Indians now." And Eddie said, "No, you can't." And Eddie tipped off the Indians, who promptly disappeared and hid. But they crossed paths again a few days later, and Foster did murder and cannibalize. He's the only person who did that in the party. This is modern day Sutter's Fort, which is right in the middle of Sacramento. It's right in the middle of a city now, but if this is photo taken from the inside, it looks very much as it did. And this is where Reed is desperately trying to scare up. There aren't, I mean, there aren't a lot of people who want to go out into the mountains and possibly lose their lives. Reed couldn't even pay them enough. And the men who were in California had just generally been through the Mexican American War, and they weren't interested in taking on this new challenge. But Reed made it worth their while, and so some of them did go along. It took until February 18th to get the first of four rescue parties there. Um, there were several, like thwarted attempts. The snow in the Sierras is very heavy and wet. It's colloquially called Sierra cement. That's what skiers call it, and that's what it feels like. So when they set up the winter camps, um, they just ran out of food. They really had very little left. They slaughtered the oxen. They used every bit of it for food. The hides became the roofs of the cabins. There was heavy snow at frequent intervals because Patrick Green started to keep a diary. And the diaries then were not like a touchy-feely diary like we think of. It was, it snowed today. This was what happened. Um, the deaths, which began in late November, continued into the winter. They desperately tried everything for food. I mean, anything that was made of animals, like the Murphy kids ate a rug because it was made of animal skin, bit by bit. They boiled hides, they boiled leather of their shoes, they boiled leather from book bindings, bones of animals were boiled. Um, and literally, Mrs. Reed ate herself out of house and home. She had to take pieces of her roof off. It was animal hide, and boil it and feed it to her children. Um, so the it's very difficult to even wrap our minds around this. There's just it's beyond the pale, but we have enough documentation that we know all these things happened. And when the first rescue party came, um, the survivors were mostly numb or in delirium at that point, and they would go out and sit out in the sun during the day because it was at least they got a little bit of warmth. And one woman called out as this group came, "Are you men from California or do you come from heaven?" But they didn't know if they were alive or dead at that point. And the first group could not rescue everyone. Glover left with all the Reed families, but Patty and Tommy had to turn back. They were just too small. And I mean, heartbreakingly, Patty, who's 9, 10 years old, says to her mother, "Well, Ma, if you never see me again, do the best you can." These kids just had so much courage. This first group did reunite with James Reed on his way over in the mountains, and they had an emotional reunion, and he wrote, bread was the first thing that everybody asked for. The second uh, rescue team had James Reed in it, um, and the men that he brought back, and most of them were sailors because they had come from San Francisco up to Sacramento. So James Reed lost no time in filing for free land in the time that he spent in California. He forged some applications in the name of family members. And as he hoped, he was put in charge of Mission San Jose. So he's really one of the white settlers of San Jose. Um, Foster and Eddie had been part of that snowshoe party which started to cannibalize, and they were able to come back. It took quite a long time. And then it's still snowing in March, believe it or not. It was the ninth storm. Eddie took a listing. He numbered all the storms in his diary. And that last one, Fallon, departed with just one person, Keysburg. And this is one of the mysteries of the Donner Party. Keysburg was back with he's the German man who was abusive to his wife. There were very few people left there, but Tamsin Donner was one, and she was given the option, don't you want to leave with your children? And she said, no, I'm going to stay with my husband. He was dying. He was the one who got injured, George Donner, when his arm was cut, when he was repairing his wagon and gangrene had set in. So she made the choice to stay with her husband rather than her children. And unfortunately, all her children were orphaned because Tamsin died. And it's speculated that Keysburg killed her um, to cannibalize her, but we'll never know. People often ask, what was the final count? Slightly more than half of the people lived. Two of the people died shortly after rescue. This is also kind of tragic. One of them was a teenage boy. We all know teenage boys can eat. And when this kid was given food, they were all told, don't eat too much because you're starving, your stomach will burst. And he went back and found some food secretly and ate it. And that's exactly what happened to him. And the, the horrors of this story just never seem to end. Um, why did why did survivors survive? It's an interesting question. More statistically, more men than women died. Part of it, and also age. About 1 in 3 of the kids died, and those tended to be the youngest ones. Um, Physiology had to do with it. Women have more body fat than men do. They had more body fat to draw on. Family support, the single, if you do a one-on-one analysis, the people who had family support tended to do better, and the men frankly took more risks. I mean, there were women in the snowshoe party, but generally the men would go farther afield to try to seek help and deplete their physical stamina by doing that. We get to California. Well, it ought to be a beautiful country to pay us for our trouble getting there, says Virginia Reed. She wrote a very famous letter. She had promised her cousin back in Springfield, Illinois, that she would write her when she got to California. And there was no um, Pony Express or anything, but they would they would go along the way and take letters, people who were going east. So James Reed was happy. He felt he struck gold. He built a house, and he had more children. And Mexico was conquered. The outline of the United States was much like it is now, not entirely. And 30 years later, they brought out a book about it because some of the survivors were still alive. And this monument is out there. You can see it if you go. That's the height of the snow that winter. And Virginia Patty and their adopted sister, Frances Donner, who lived with them, came to that ceremony. And Virginia says, never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. And I have taken a little bit too long myself here, but I hope that we have time for a few questions.
Marian, thank you so much. Fantastic storytelling. I was alert the entire time. You really took us through that journey. Um, so our first question is, do you have anything on Sarah Keys? Perhaps Alcove Spring? I am a trustee of the park she is buried in.
Yeah, I don't by anything, do you mean like research or pictures?
That's probably what they're meaning.
Yeah, no, just the story and the general outlines of what's known about her.
We had a question. When you're referring to employees or hired hands, do you mean enslaved people, or were they
No,
free paid?
no, they were paid. Some were housekeepers who had worked for the families back in Springfield, and the Teamsters who were hired were paid. No,
Uh,
there were no enslaved people on the trip.
um, questions they're just roll in.
Okay.
Are there any books that you'd recommend for someone interested in diving a little deeper into this besides your own?
Yeah, I still think the best book on the Donner Party is one that was written in the 1930s by George Stewart, who was an English professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Um, and I can tell you the name of it in a minute. Um, it is he tells the story almost in a novelistic way, but it's factually accurate. It has a few um, references that are a little bit crude these days, but it's still a great. I still think it's the very best book on the Donner Party, and I'm looking for his uh, Ordeal by Hunger. That's what it's called. Um, then fairly recently, in the past couple of years, I don't have the name of it in front of me, but it's an Oxford University Press book which updates the history of the Donner Party. Those are my favorites. And then there are collections of diary entries by Donners and other westward bound pioneers that I find fascinating because you're really hearing about it in the voices of the men and women who went out there. There's one that's called Pioneer Children on the Journey West by Emmy Werner. And it's based on the diaries, letters, and reminiscences of 120 children and teenagers who went on Western migrations, not just the Donner Party. I like that one as well.
Well, speaking of children and those reminiscences, was it kind of a standard thing that they really grew up fast and were all pretty mature for their age?
Yeah, two of the Green boys buried the dead because they were the strongest. You know, they were young men and they were strong. And one of them said, I'm paraphrasing, it was sadly easy because the people were so light.
Well, you have a couple thank yous from Amy and Karen in the chat here. And also, everyone, please go out and buy the book. I posted a link in the chat log to try to make it as easy as possible for you.
Oh,
Um,
thanks. Unfortunately, the book is out of print, but you can still find used copies of it. It was in print for a good 20 years. No, wait, when did it come out? 1999. It was in print for up till a couple years ago. Um, And if you go on Amazon or eBay or places like that, you can find used copies because it was in about 2,000 libraries and it was a Scholastic Book Club book. Uh, I really wanted to do an update for the 175th a few years ago, but my publisher was acquired and COVID happened, and you know how those things go. But I encourage you to read about it from every angle. It's a fascinating story. It never gets old.
So, about the diaries or journals, were there multiple party members that were keeping diaries, or was it mainly a single individual?
No, not many did. James Reed kept a diary. It was more factual than what we think of as diaries these days. Uh, Patrick Breen kept a diary after they were stuck in the mountains. But that book I alluded to towards the end by Charles McGlashan, he was a newspaper editor in Truckee, and enough time had passed that he reached out to the survivors and asked them to tell their stories. And enough time had passed that finally they were ready to talk because several of them wrote about it and talked about it at that point in ways that we would now identify as post-traumatic stress. They didn't obviously call it that. Their
Right.
idea was get to California, forget it happened, and move on. But they, of course, had these memories, and he drew them out, and generally they wrote them down. It was great. And that book is still available. And he was a newspaper editor, so he would put out a new edition every year or two when he got more letters, or sometimes people would change things or they'd argue with something somebody else had written. So it was a living document in more of a way than most books are. And Virginia wrote an article for a magazine, which I'm sure was partly ghost written for her because it didn't sound like exactly her voice. But she became very successful. She married fairly early. She married an army man, and she became the first woman to sell insurance in California.
Very cool.
So, yeah.
You've got another thank you by Carol here and said that she's visited Alcove Spring in Kansas. I think a question everybody has is, the debate about the cutoff. If everything would have gone according to what they had been told, how much time really would they have saved by taking the cutoff?
Probably not much. It's debatable. Where I think they lost time was when they'd say, "Well, let's take another day to regroup or to work on the wagons,"
Right.
and that all added up. Um, Curiously, uh, and this happened in Kansas, they were right near the Missouri line. And actually, John Breen called it the limit of civilization. When he wrote in 1877, he was one of the teenagers of the time. Um, they uh, they stayed there 5 days because they were stuck with getting with the creek rising, the river rising. But in other places, they would stay an extra day. They would stay an extra, and then in Truckee Meadows, they thought, well, we really have to regain our strength. And so it's another debatable question. But the Hastings cutoff was not, uh, didn't make things easier. Who it made things easier for was the Mormons. They hacked their way, the Donners. I mean, at some places, they had to literally hack their way. They didn't have machetes. It would have been easier if they did. They had to axe things, down trees. That path that they created is what the Mormons used to get to Salt Lake. So
Wow.
that's who they made it easier for.
And yeah, leaving just yet another mark on the landscape. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, there's just endless interest in interesting little factoids about them. And the snowshoe party, I think 10 of the 15 survived. I don't have the number exactly in front of me. The reason that they could do that is because a member of the party was originally from Vermont and he knew how to make snowshoes. The Breens from Ireland would not have known how to make snowshoes. The folks from Illinois didn't know how to make snowshoes, but the guy from Vermont did, and you know, that's it. And another thing that kept them alive was that clothes were made out of wool then. Wool keeps you warm even when it's wet.
Right.
And in Patagonia fleece, it wouldn't have happened. So,
Well, Marian, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. We've all enjoyed this story. Like I said, you're a fantastic storyteller. Everyone, go be sure to pick up a copy of her book.
yeah.
And I hope everyone here can join us next month, May 8th, to hear Donna Ray Pearson present The Women of Brown. So Marian, thank you again.
Oh,
And
it was my pleasure. Thank you all.
well, from everyone here at Museum After Hours, thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Okay.